Good evening and welcome to Questions of Faith. Recently, a conference was held here in Gibraltar with invited guest speaker Steve Ray. He is a speaker on numerous topics centering on the teachings of the Catholic faith. An academic with a vast knowledge of the early origins of Christianity, he is a widely published author with books such as Crossing the Tiber, Evangelical Protestants Discover the Historical Church, Upon This Rock, St. Peter and the Primacy of Rome in Scripture, and the Early Church. He has gone on recently to pursue other forms of media to spread his beliefs. He is currently producing a 10-part video series called The Footprints of God, the story of salvation from Abraham to Augustine. In this series, he travels to historic sites across the globe to visit and share with his audience places referenced in the earliest teachings of Christianity. In Gibraltar, it is considered the norm to be raised under one denomination or faith, but for Steve Ray, this was not the case. He was raised in a devout, loving Baptist family. His father was a deacon and Bible teacher, and Stephen was very involved in the Baptist church as a teacher of biblical studies, lecturing on a wide range of topics. Yet, Steve and his wife Janet entered the Catholic Church in 1994. The conversion process to Catholicism was described by him as being moved by a process beyond his control. And he wasn't the only one caught up in that whirlwind. His wife, Janet, and their 4 children were swept along as well. The Rays had never wanted to become Catholic. They never even set foot in a Catholic church until the day after they decided to join. So what caused them to embrace their new faith? This was a question I put to them.
I had a marvelous childhood. My parents became Christians a year before I was born. They were converted from being pagans into the Baptist tradition. And so I was raised in a very loving, wonderful Baptist family, also very anti-Catholic. I learned about the Catholic Church from a young age, that they had everything backwards, that they didn't believe the Bible, that they were going to hell. And so as I grew up, we always thought it was our job to get Catholics saved and get them to be true Christians, since they weren't really Christians. Our journey to the Catholic Church itself began because I began as I got older and I loved the Bible. The more I studied the Bible and was giving talks in Bible studies, I realized that there were big problems with Protestantism. The kind of problems that were, if you fixed them, it would be Catholic. And I realized that there was no way to overcome these problems within Protestantism. And my first thought was almost to being an agnostic, until a friend of mine converted to the Catholic Church, and me trying to convince him he was wrong, convinced myself he was right, and here we are, Catholics today. Best kept secret in the world.
We did the whole thing together. But what was fun was the Lord used different things to get us over the same hurdles. So my understanding of Mary was put to rest when I read St. Jerome's treatise on the perpetual virginity of Mary. I read it to Steve. It didn't work for him. He had to read Mary, the Second Eve from Cardinal Newman. So it was fun watching how the Lord worked, but we did things together. Steve is pretty much the researcher. I'm more of the editor. I will help him to perfect the things that he has written and things that he's done. So
she challenges me.
Yeah.
She's got the good questions. I may be thinking along one line and she'll say, yes, but what about this and this? Oh, then I have to turn another corner. So our minds work well together.
Yes, we complement each other.
We knew that if we ever would do something like becoming Catholic, it would be an earthquake in our family. From my standpoint, my family, they were new Baptists. they were new converts. They were excited about it. They had found the Bible and the Baptist tradition. So if I were going to become Catholic, it's like I go over to the enemy camp. Like I've joined the enemy army, and it would be a disaster. And it was for our family for about 2 years. Real strife, real division, separation. But over time, they saw the results of it in our life, especially in our kids. They saw the positive results, and they said, eventually, we cannot argue with the results. This must be what God wanted you to do, so we accept it. Her family on the other side, you tell a story about how she's the first Catholic in 400 years in her family.
So for my family, it was a family betrayal. How can you betray the family and become Catholic? Something that our family had not done for over 400 years. So it was very difficult, but the Lord used several things to get my family over the hurdle. One of them was they live near the world's largest crucifix in Indian River, Michigan. The corpus is 56 feet long, Jesus on the cross. His bronze corpus is 56 feet long, and they live a half a mile from it. And for the first time, a year after we became Catholic, they went over to that Catholic church and they walked the grounds, saw it for the first time. So when we went up to visit them after pretty much not speaking for a whole year, they said, "Oh, have you been to the cross in the woods? It's so beautiful. And take the girls to the gift shop." And I was shocked. And the Lord just worked everything out.
I've always had a strong belief in God and the existence of God. So the debate between theism and atheism was never an issue. I always accepted. I just knew that to atheists, there's no rational position there. I mean, if you're an atheist, there's no meaning to life. It's all it's a sick joke. Ultimately, the earth's going to burn up. We're all going to burn up with it. So why even think anybody is important? It's a joke. With a Christian position, a theist position, there is a God who has ultimate purpose and meaning in life. When I say I love my wife, it means something because God, who is love, created me in his image to love, and so it means something to her. If I'm an atheist, I only have to say I'm having a hormonal reaction for you. So that was never the issue. But then the issue came down, if there is a God, how does he manifest himself, and what does he want me to do? And then it comes into the idea of a church, or what group, where is he manifesting himself? Being a part of Protestant denominations, and we were part of many of them over time, we realized that within there's a lot of infighting and disagreement and no source of authority. On the other hand, I saw the Catholic Church, and I'm summarizing this very quickly, that's been 2,000 years, the same teachings, the same basic morality, and has the same leadership all the way through and ties its roots into Judaism. And after a lot of reading, I didn't talk to anybody about it. I read my way in through history, theology, the Bible, philosophy, and in doing that, I was convinced the Catholic Church was the way God was manifesting himself primarily to the world today. And I left the Protestants, as I call them, a protest, and I joined the Catholic Church. Best thing we ever did.
From delivering his conferences all over the world to thousands of listeners, we asked Steve not only how it was that he came to Gibraltar, but also why it is that he holds such strong convictions towards his chosen faith.
Oh, what brought us to Gibraltar? We were invited to come here by Christine and her husband, Javier. And ultimately, though, it was because we spoke on the island of Malta last year, gave a conference there, and Christine heard us there, and she asked us to come here. So, and it was also through a man named Surat Fernandez, who gets us to go to different places in the world giving these conferences, doing apologetics. And so it's a combination of those folks and our talks at Malta. Here we are in Gibraltar. First time, wanted to see this rock, heard about it ever since I was a kid, and I'm glad we get to see it right up close. Yeah, the question being about our clinging and our adherence to the Bible, and when it actually came about in the process, and that there were guys called apostolic fathers, and there were bishops and popes before the New Testament was collected in a book. We grew up, both of us did, with the idea of sola scriptura. That was the Reformation cry of Martin Luther and the others. Bible alone. Get rid of the popes and councils. Get rid of the traditions, and we just have the book. Problem is, the book didn't come along at the beginning. How did the earliest Christians know how to live their Christian life? How did they know who God was, what the church was, what we should do on Sunday morning, how one has a relationship with Christ? All of these things came not through a book for the first 4 centuries. They came through tradition. They came through the teaching of the apostles. The apostles taught others who became known as the apostolic fathers. They got that name because they knew the apostles. Some of them said, we still have the words of the apostles ringing in our ears, long before the New Testament was ever collected and put in a book that you could hand someone. So I realized that there was something before the Bible alone. What was it? It was a living church. It was a church with a magisterium, big scary word. just means teaching office, office of teachers. There was a living church that had been given the responsibility to teach, and what they taught, part of the tradition they taught us, and then later part of it got written down and became called the New Testament. So I realized that it could not be Bible alone. It was scripture, tradition, and the magisterium teaching office of the church. Once that was in place, everything made sense to me. Martin Luther decided that he was going to rebel against the one church that had been there 1,500 years. He threw the Pope away. Didn't realize when he did that he created 1 billion new popes, because every Protestant, in theory and in practice, becomes their own pope. Well, there's two faiths that we could be discussing here as to having obstacles. First of all, the idea of whether there's a God or not, faith in a divine being, and then once that we become Catholic, doubt in that we're correct or incorrect in being Catholics. I mentioned earlier that when we studied together the whole idea of whether there's a God or not, I jettisoned all my doubts of that when I realized you really only have two positions. There either is some kind of an artist out there who created, and therefore this infinite reference point gives purpose and meaning to the finite points, like me and you and everybody else. If there's not that, the only other alternative is that everything has an impersonal beginning. Time plus chance plus matter or energy just swirling, and out of it, we are the accidents that comes out of that. When you realize that it ultimately boils down to one of those two, I have no problem saying I have no doubts, because the only philosophy that answers adequately all the questions is Christianity. Any anti-theist point of view ends up in despair. So there has to be a God. This is no hesitation on our part of that. Now we come to the Catholic Church. We have all these different religions. I'm convinced that Christianity is true. I've studied that too, the whole historicity of it, the actual life and death and resurrection of Jesus being a historical fact. There's a lot of evidence that almost screams at you, you have to believe this is true. Then it comes down to what form should it take. And in coming with the Catholic Church, when I do a historical study, all the churches that I belong to were only 100 years old, 200 years old. They were started by this man or that man. Only the Catholic Church could claim to have the unbroken chain with no links missing, all the way back to the 1st century. But started by Jesus, who said, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And they haven't. And here, 2,000 years later, that same church is here teaching the same things he did, same line of authority. Yes, we have problems. Yes, we have bishops who are screwy. Yes, we have all kinds of issues. Yes, we've got crazy people in our church. But then again, it's not a haven for saints. The church is mainly a hospital for sinners, which is why we joined. And I've never looked back.
We're going for a short commercial break now. Please join us in part 2 as we see Steve in action on stage.